Most people believe that memory is built from details, faces, voices, expressions, but there is a category of recollection that behaves differently. It does not preserve features, it preserves absence. Across decades, individuals with no connection to one another have described remembering a man-shaped presence with no face, no defining traits, no emotional signal. What disturbs them is not what they saw, but how certain they are that it was there, and how little it allowed itself to be understood. The earliest accounts rarely begin with fear, they begin with recognition. Witnesses describe entering a room, waking in the night, or pausing during routine activity and realizing they were no longer alone. There is no sound to mark the moment, no movement that draws attention. The awareness arrives fully formed, as if it had always been present and was only now being acknowledged. When they try to recall what stood before them, language fails. They do not say featureless at first. They say blank or unfinished or empty where a person should be. In police interviews, therapy sessions, and anonymous written statements archived in obscure databases, a pattern emerges. The figure is always upright, always proportioned like an adult male, always still. Witnesses struggle to describe clothing, height, or distance, yet insist with complete confidence that it was not a shadow, not a trick of light, not a dream fragment. Many specify that they were fully awake. Some were speaking moments before. Others were in motion. The experience interrupts continuity rather than emerging from it. Attempts to remember the face produce a strange effect. People report a mental resistance, as if their thoughts slide away from the center. Some describe nausea or pressure behind the eyes when they try. Others report that the memory feels censored, not erased, but inaccessible. It is not that there was no face. It is that the concept of a face does not apply. This distinction appears repeatedly, regardless of the witness's background or belief system. What makes these reports unsettling to researchers is their emotional consistency. The hollow man, as he is sometimes called in later retellings, does not behave like a threat. There is no chase, no aggression, no warning. Witnesses do not recall being afraid in the moment. Fear arrives later, after reflection, when they realize that nothing about the encounter followed familiar psychological patterns. The presence does not react to observation. It does not retreat when noticed. It does not acknowledge being seen. In several documented cases, individuals attempted to test the experience. They spoke aloud, they moved closer, they left the room and returned. The figure remained unchanged, as if unaffected by interaction. One witness described the sensation as standing in front of a mirror that refused to reflect anything back. Another compared it to encountering an authority that required no justification, not hostile, not benevolent, simply there. Some clinicians initially categorized these encounters alongside sleep-related hallucinations, but inconsistencies quickly complicated that explanation. A significant portion of witnesses reported no history of sleep paralysis, night terrors, or dissociative episodes. Medical evaluations often showed no abnormalities. More notably, the encounters did not repeat frequently. For many, it happened once, briefly, and never again. Yet the memory persisted with unusual clarity, except for the features themselves. There are earlier references that resist easy classification. In mid-20th century institutional records, vague mentions appear of human outlines without identifiers, reported during periods of prolonged isolation. These were often dismissed or redacted, their language deliberately imprecise. The absence of detail was treated as evidence of unreliability, not as a characteristic of the phenomenon itself. Over time, such reports were quietly excluded from formal analysis. The most troubling element may be how witnesses describe the figure's attention. Many insist they were being observed, evaluated, or measured despite no visible eyes. This sense does not come from behavior, but from intuition. They describe it as immediate and unquestionable, as if the rules governing observation had been reversed, as if they were the object being examined. If you are listening to this and feel a vague sense of familiarity, pause and consider why. Many who encounter these accounts report an unease that feels personal, even without a memory to attach it to. If you have experienced something similar, or if you remain skeptical but unsettled, this is where reflection matters. Quietly questioning what qualifies as evidence, or what experiences are excluded from record, is part of how these patterns surface at all. What remains consistent is what doesn't happen. The hollow man doesn't speak, he doesn't move closer, he doesn't linger once attention shifts elsewhere. When the moment ends, it ends completely. There is no aftermath, no physical trace, only the knowledge that something was present, fully formed in its emptiness, and that it did not require recognition to exist. In the next part, the focus will shift away from testimony and toward mechanism, not to explain the figure away, but to examine why the human mind reacts so strongly to absence, and why certain forms of nothingness feel structured, intentional, and disturbingly familiar. Human perception is not built to recognize everything, it is built to predict. Long before conscious thought intervenes, the brain assembles fragments into expectations. Faces should have eyes, bodies should signal intent, movement should follow cause. When those expectations are violated, the response is not curiosity, it is alarm. Not the kind that produces panic, but the kind that freezes interpretation. Researchers describe it as a prediction error without resolution. Something is present, but the model fails. This reaction has been documented extensively in studies on facial recognition. Even crude approximations of faces trigger strong neural responses. 2 dots and a line are often enough. But when a human-shaped form lacks features entirely, the response becomes unstable. Imaging studies show heightened activity in regions associated with threat detection and self-referential processing, even when subjects report no conscious fear. The brain continues to search for meaning that never arrives. During the Cold War, this vulnerability was not merely academic. Declassified research into sensory deprivation, conducted in North America and Europe, repeatedly noted the emergence of human-like presences, reported by subjects held in low-stimulus environments. These figures were often described as neutral, featureless, and silent. The reports were treated as byproducts of stress and isolation, yet internal memos reveal concern about their consistency. The same descriptions appeared regardless of cultural background or prior suggestion. One internal report from the late 1950s notes that subjects reacted more strongly to entities that did nothing than to those that threatened or spoke. The absence of interaction prolonged distress. Without feedback, the mind could not categorize the presence as ally or enemy. It remained unresolved. In later trials, researchers attempted to induce similar effects using visual ambiguity, masking faces, or erasing identifying traits. The results suggested that removal of features did not reduce emotional impact, it intensified it. Psychologists studying trauma have observed a related phenomenon. Survivors of interrogations or institutional confinement often recall authority figures not by their actions, but by what they withheld. No names, no expressions, no justification. The memory becomes anchored to absence rather than behavior. Over time, the figure loses individuality and becomes symbolic, not through exaggeration, but through subtraction. What remains is not a person, but a role emptied of humanity. This framing complicates attempts to dismiss Hollow Man encounters as hallucinations. Hallucinations typically exaggerate, they add. Voices speak, shapes distort, threats escalate. But in these accounts, nothing escalates, nothing is embellished. The experience is defined by restraint. The figure's stillness mirrors the brain's inability to progress. Witnesses often say the moment felt longer than it was, not because anything happened, but because nothing resolved. Neurologists studying depersonalization describe a similar suspension. Patients report feeling observed by something internal yet external, familiar yet unreachable. However, those episodes are usually accompanied by emotional blunting or dissociation. Hollow Man witnesses report the opposite: heightened clarity, sharpened awareness, a sense that the environment became more real, not less, as if something had stripped away interpretation and left only presence. There is also the matter of memory encoding. Events that defy categorization are often forgotten or distorted, yet these encounters persist. Years later, individuals can recall the spatial layout of the room, the time of night, even the temperature. What they cannot recall is the figure itself, beyond its outline. Researchers suggest this may be because the memory is anchored to the self, not the object. The witness remembers being seen, not seeing. Some speculative theorists argue that the Hollow Man represents a cognitive boundary, a manifestation that occurs when perception encounters something it cannot model, not a being, but a placeholder. Others caution against this abstraction, pointing out that such explanations risk normalizing something that may still be poorly understood. What matters is that the experience behaves differently from known perceptual errors. It does not degrade with time. It does not integrate into narrative memory. It remains isolated. What is notably absent from all documented accounts is mercy. Not cruelty, but mercy. The figure does not respond to distress. It does not comfort. It does not retreat when fear sets in. This neutrality is what transforms unease into something deeper. People can forgive hostility. They can rationalize threat. But indifference resists moral framing. It suggests a system operating without regard for human emotional economies. As more accounts surfaced in the early internet era, researchers noticed that people often hesitated to share them publicly, not out of shame, but uncertainty. They feared mislabeling the experience, reducing it to a trope or a symptom. Many accounts remained buried in academic footnotes, anonymized case files, or abandoned forums. The pattern persisted quietly, without acknowledgement. In the next part, the focus will narrow further, examining why witnesses so often describe the Hollow Man, not as malicious, but as something for which mercy is simply irrelevant, and what that implies about the nature of the encounter itself. Mercy implies choice. It assumes that an entity recognizes suffering and decides whether or not to alleviate it. What unsettles witnesses of the Hollow Man is not that mercy is denied, but that it never seems to be considered. The figure's presence does not fluctuate in response to fear, pleading, or defiance. It does not punish, it does not reassure, it does not acknowledge distress as a variable at all. In multiple case studies, individuals describe attempting to provoke a reaction. Some spoke directly to it, asking what it wanted, why it was there. Others moved closer, testing whether proximity would trigger a response. A few attempted humor or hostility, anything that might force the situation into a familiar social dynamic. None reported success. The figure remained unchanged, as if interaction itself was outside its operational parameters. This behavior distinguishes the Hollow Man from most recorded anomalous figures. Apparitions threaten or warn. Intruders flee or confront. Even imagined presences tend to mirror the emotional state of the observer. Here, there is no mirroring. The witness brings emotion into the space, but nothing reflects it back. The effect is profoundly destabilizing. Humans rely on feedback to orient themselves morally and socially. When feedback is absent, meaning collapses. Historical parallels emerge in accounts of bureaucratic and institutional power stripped of human interface. Survivors of certain authoritarian systems have described interrogators who spoke minimally, displayed no effect, and offered no explanation. The harm did not always come from violence, but from opacity, from rules that could not be questioned because they were never articulated. The Hollow Man, in this reading, resembles authority without narrative, presence without justification. Some researchers have noted that witnesses rarely describe the figure entering or leaving. It is simply there, and then it is not. There is no transition. This reinforces the sense that the encounter is not an event unfolding in time, but a state briefly imposed, a suspension of normal relational structures. During this interval, the witness exists in a condition of being observed without context. The absence of mercy becomes significant here. Mercy would imply evaluation followed by leniency. Cruelty would imply intent to harm. The Hollow Man appears to do neither. It does not act because action is unnecessary. Whatever function it serves is fulfilled by presence alone. This idea appears repeatedly in speculative analysis, not as a conclusion, but as a troubling pattern that resists dismissal. In several anonymized interviews, witnesses described a lingering change afterward. Not trauma in the conventional sense, but a recalibration. They reported increased sensitivity to silence, to empty rooms, to moments when systems pause without explanation. Some became preoccupied with watching rather than participating. Others developed an aversion to mirrors, surveillance cameras, or situations where they felt observed without reciprocity. These changes were subtle but persistent. Importantly, none reported receiving information. No message, no warning, no instruction. The encounter conveys nothing that can be acted upon. This is perhaps its most disturbing quality. Experiences that change belief systems usually offer some form of narrative. Even fear provides a story. The hollow man provides nothing. It leaves the witness alone with the knowledge that meaning can be withheld entirely. Attempts to categorize the figure as a projection of authority, trauma, or evolutionary fear response offer partial explanations but fail to account for the uniformity of description across unrelated contexts. The stillness, the proportion, the certainty of presence. These elements recur with a precision that exceeds most subjective phenomena. Yet there is no evidence of coordination, contagion, or cultural transmission that would easily explain it. As researchers debate interpretation, one question continues to surface: why does the figure appear at all? If it neither communicates nor acts, why manifest? Some propose that the encounter occurs at thresholds, moments when identity, autonomy, or continuity is briefly destabilized. Others suggest it marks a failure state, when cognitive systems designed to assign agency encounter something fundamentally unassignable. Whatever the explanation, the hollow man does not linger long enough to be studied directly. It leaves no residue, no measurable effect beyond memory and subtle behavioral shifts. Its restraint is absolute. In a world where threats announce themselves and power demands recognition, this silence feels intentional, even if its purpose remains obscured. The final part will examine why the hollow man leaves no record, why attempts to document or depict it consistently fail, and what it means to encounter something that resists being captured, categorized, or even fully remembered. Every attempt to document the hollow man ends the same way. Drawings feel incorrect. Descriptions collapse into negation. Language circles what is missing rather than what was present. Even when witnesses compare accounts, the overlap is structural, not visual. Upright, human-shaped. Still, beyond that, nothing holds. It is as if the phenomenon resists being fixed in representation, dissolving the moment it is framed. This failure is not unique. Throughout the history of anomalous research, certain experiences refuse preservation. They survive only in testimony, and even there, imperfectly. Investigators note that the more effort a witness makes to capture the figure, the more distorted the memory becomes. Some report that concentrating on it feels intrusive, as though attention itself violates an unspoken boundary. Others say the memory fades at the edges, leaving only the certainty that something occurred. Archival efforts reflect this instability. Case files trail off, reports end abruptly. References point to missing appendices or redacted sections. In several institutional archives, mentions of featureless figures appear without follow-up, as if the subject was quietly abandoned. No conclusions, no retractions, just absence. The lack of closure is itself a pattern, suggesting not suppression, but disengagement. One hypothesis proposes that the hollow man is not an entity to be encountered, but a limit condition. A moment when perception reaches the edge of its own structure and briefly exposes what lies beyond modeling. In this view, the figure is not observed, but generated by the failure of observation. It appears not because something arrives, but because something withdraws: identity, context, meaning. This interpretation aligns with the figure's defining traits. No features, because features require relational framing. No mercy, because mercy requires moral exchange. No communication, because communication presupposes shared reference. The hollow man occupies none of these spaces. It stands where those systems momentarily collapse. The witness is left not with information, but with exposure. Yet this explanation remains speculative. It accounts for the uniformity of reports and the resistance to documentation, but it doesn't explain why some people encounter this boundary and others do not. Nor does it explain the lingering sense of being evaluated, of having been measured against something impersonal and absolute. That sensation persists in testimony, even when all other details erode. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the hollow man is not rare, that it appears frequently, but only briefly, and is usually dismissed before it can be integrated into memory. Perhaps most encounters are forgotten precisely because nothing happens. No fear spike, no narrative hook. Just a pause that resolves itself and leaves no trace strong enough to survive recall. Those who do remember may do so because they noticed the absence itself. Because something in them registered that the usual rules were not in effect. That recognition, once made, cannot be undone. It reframes silence, stillness, and neutrality as active conditions rather than empty ones. There is no evidence that the hollow man returns. No cycles, no escalation, no progression. The encounter is complete in itself. It offers no lesson, no warning, no comfort. It does not ask to be believed. It does not require acknowledgement. It simply occurs, and then it does not. What remains is the question of why such experiences exist at all, and why they are remembered only in fragments. In a culture that prioritizes visibility, explanation, and agency, something that refuses all three becomes profoundly unsettling. Not because it threatens us, but because it demonstrates how little threat is required to destabilize certainty. If the hollow man has a message, it is delivered entirely through omission. And perhaps that is why it leaves no record. Truths that cannot be framed as objects cannot be archived. They persist only as distortions in memory, as moments when the familiar structures of meaning briefly fail, and something without features or mercy stands in their place.